Welcome to what would be day 7 of managerial accounting. We had virtual class last week, so I'm counting those 2 days as well. Today, we're going to be picking up with chapter 17. I'll do just a very quick overview of what I had asked you to complete on your own during my absence last week. And I want to start with the chapter 17 reference materials folder. So what you're seeing right now is Brightspace. I went to the reference materials area and I went down to the chapter 17 folder. You can see that we still have the videos there from spring, but those will be in part replaced by today. And then there are some additional materials in here that I have included for your reference. We'll be using these in class. I think you'll find them very helpful. First, we have an Excel spreadsheet that I have created or recreated from another textbook, another edition of the textbook. So this is an Excel spreadsheet. I'm going to download it and I'm going to use it in Excel during class, and you may also want to do the same thing. So it is very helpful, both for what we're doing in class and also for the exam, that covers this chapter. That open, you may want to open that as well. If you do not have Excel at the moment, it can be, I'm certain, uploaded to your Google Drive and used as a Google Sheet. But keep in mind, you also can get Office 365 for free, which includes Excel, by logging in with your JCC username and password. So if you don't have Excel, I would encourage you to get Excel, because it does definitely have some improved functionality over what you can do in Google Sheets. I haven't personally tried to put this into Google Sheets, but I imagine it would work. You just have some formatting issues to work out. So that's one item. Exercise 6. There's a completed cost report that I had already done using that spreadsheet that I just showed you. So you may want to take a look at this, in particular if you're watching on video and not doing it live during our face-to-face class. This cost of production report is a snip from the textbook. And so I will be referring to this. It's Exhibit 8 in Chapter 17. I will refer to these by the step numbers that are listed here. And you may find this as useful as a reference, but you'll also notice it looks very similar, very much the same as the template that I have provided to you here that's blank for our use. And lastly, after we finish Chapter 17, you'll be working on the Chapter 17 mastery problem, which is another one that's a bit tricky. And so there is a mastery problem explained video here. I strongly encourage you to try it on your own and then use the video as needed. I would also warn you that sometimes the numbers that are in my videos may be different than the numbers you see in your problem. So the problem would be exactly the same, but the numbers may be generated algorithmically. And so the numbers that I show in the video, you would need to recalculate following the same formulas and techniques that I use in the video. So it may not be that you can just watch the video and plug the numbers in. I don't want to mislead anyone. Sometimes it works that way and sometimes it doesn't. So we should be, fingers crossed, we should be finishing Chapter 17 today. And if we do, then the Chapter 17 exercises should be submitted by the end of the day today for grading in CNow. And then the problem would be due on Thursday. Either way, if we have to carry a little bit over to Thursday, we'll still be starting Chapter 18 on Thursday as well. And so the Chapter 18 pre-quiz is due on Thursday. And we'll finish Chapter 18 next Tuesday. We should be back on track. Even if we carry a bit of 17 over, we should be back on track by the end of Chapter 18, finishing on Tuesday, the 20th. problem then would be due on the 22nd on Thursday, and that's the final chapter on our first of 4 exams. So we'll talk a little bit more about exam 1 on Thursday. I will actually show you the exam in CNow, and we'll talk, see how many questions, see the types of questions that are on there, and we'll talk a little bit more also about the practice set of exercises that are not required. They're not graded, but I encourage you to try those practice exercises before you take the exam, because the exercises that are on the practice set are very, very similar to the ones that are on the exam. That's why I put them in the practice set, so that you would have more chance to practice those topics. So before we jump into the chapter 17 exercises, does anyone have any questions, anything you want to talk about? Okay. So let's go to the chapter 17 exercises. I'm going to collapse that side panel to give us a little bit more room. And as you heard last week, my request was that you work on the first 2 exercises on your own. And so we're going to pick up in exercise 3. But the first 2 exercises, there's really nothing new there beyond what we did in chapter 15 and 16, because it's talking about the flow of cost through the inventory accounts in a manufacturing company's accounting information system. The only thing that is different from that respect, the only thing that's different for a company that uses process costing compared to a company that uses job order costing that we covered in chapter 16, is that companies that use process costing usually have more than one work in process account. So they still have the same 3 types that we have learned starting in chapter 15. They have materials, work in process, and finished goods. But they may have more than one work in process account. And so they use the one work in process account for each step in their manufacturing process. So they may call them departments, they may call them steps in the process, but they would have a separate account for each one of those steps. Where in job order costing, we had those subsidiary ledger cards, but they weren't part of the general ledger. In the general ledger, there was just one work in process account that encompassed all of the jobs that were currently in process. But for a process cost using company, if they have multiple steps in their process, they will have multiple work in process accounts. And so what you see is the flow of costs, not just going from materials to work in process to finished goods, but it might go through 3 separate work in process accounts in sequence before it gets to finished goods. Again, just as an example. So what you're asked to do here in exercise 17, and again in exercise 18, is really thinking about those same concepts that we already talked about, both with the flow of costs and then with applying factory overhead. So both of those should be reviewed for you. I would be happy to answer questions. They also have, at least this one has the show me how if you get stuck, and they're covered in those videos, or that video that I had asked you to watch. And so where we're going to pick up today, one last chance, questions, anybody before? I don't want to rush us through, but nobody's asking anything, so. Okay, so where we're going to pick up today then is with exercise 3, or the 3rd exercise in the set. And for this one, you really don't need to have that Excel template that I already showed you. We'll get to that once we get to a more comprehensive problem. But exercise 3, you can see the title is equivalent units of production. Exercise, let me find. We're going to be doing that same equivalent units of production calculation a couple more times in exercise 7. And they're in exercise 10 as well. So this is a topic that flows through the rest of the chapter. If you look at kind of the template that's provided here in part A, we go over here to the Excel template. What we're doing in that, make this a little bit bigger. So what we're doing in this first exercise is this part, the very top part of the cost of production template. So the headings that you see over here on the left-hand side correspond with the same headings that you see here. So we're doing the first part of the production template. If I pull, there it is. So if I pull this back up, it's the part labeled step 1 and then the part labeled step 2. So of the 4 steps in the cost of production report, we're doing the first 2 in this exercise. Important note about these first 2 steps, these steps account for units only. So you'll notice everything is headed units, units, units. There are no dollars involved in steps 1 and 2. It is units of work only, units of the product that we are working on. So if you think about the way we had defined and described a company using a process costing system, we said that the company that uses process costing does so because there isn't a clearly defined beginning or end to the product, to the process of making the product. So in other words, we don't, the example that I had given you in class was at an oil refinery. They're putting barrels of crude oil in one end of the system and it mixes with all the other oil that's already in the system and they're refining it and separating it into its separate parts. So there would be no way to say, okay, here's barrel number 1. Now let's track what happens with barrel number 1 because it's getting mixed in a continuous process with all the other barrels that were put in before it and the barrels that are coming in after it. It is not the same as making a house where you know, oh, look, we built that house and now we're done. So what makes the reporting different for a company that uses process costing is they're reporting on what happened in a period of time rather than reporting on what happened with a specific product or batch of products like we do in job order costing. So we can see in the heading for this report in letter A that this report is for everything that happened in June. So it's likely, unless this was a brand new company, it's likely that they were already working on some stuff that they started in May and it carried over to June. In fact, if we're looking at, in this report is for the drawing department. So if we look at the drawing department column up here, we can see that at the beginning of June, we were already working on 10,000 units that we had started in May, but just hadn't finished. How much of the work had we done? It tells us they were 38% completed. Okay. Then in June, we started an additional 60,000 units. So we had 10,000 already in process. We started 60,000 more. So we were working on a total of 70,000 units at some point during the month of June. 70,000 units in process at one point, probably not all at the same time. And at the end of the month, what did we have? Well, just because it was the end of June doesn't mean we stopped work and we were done with everything. And we can see here that there were actually 11,500 units that we were still working on at the end of June, and we were 70% done with those. So if we had 60,000 units started, plus the 10,000 that were already in beginning inventory, we were working on a total of 70, and 11,500 were not finished at the end of the month. So how many did we finish during the month of June? We had 70,000 we were working on, and 11,500 aren't done.
58,500.
We must have finished 58,500, exactly. Of those 58,500, 10,000 were from beginning inventory, and then 48,500 we started and completed in that same month. Everybody, does that make sense? Just what I'm talking through right now before we start putting the numbers in the template? Okay. So we have a couple assumptions that we make here, and here's the first one I have highlighted on the screen. All direct materials are placed in process at the beginning of production. So do you ever make cookies? Have you ever made, like, let's say chocolate chip cookies from scratch? Any,
It's been-
just Carter?
Yeah,
Nobody else has made cookies before? You made cookies before? Okay, so how do you make cookies? What do you do?
flour, eggs,
Okay.
um,
Butter, sugar, vanilla, probably some chocolate chips, baking powder, soda. Do you just throw everything in the bowl and then start mixing?
you measure first.
Measure? What do you do, Nanji?
Well, I mean, just try kitchen second.
Okay. So you actually, so is there anyone who wants to say, yeah, no, that's not how I do it. I just throw everything in the bowl and start, because usually this is a smaller class, but usually there's someone in the class who's like, follow those directions where it says to cream the butter and sugar and then add the eggs one at a time until it's light and fluffy, lemon colored or whatever it says on the directions. There's usually one person who will say, yeah, okay, I just start measure, I do measure, but it all just goes in the bowl and then I just mix it all together. Usually there's someone who will say that. Apparently not in this class, that's okay. That's the rule we are going to follow for this class. We are going to assume that when you start working on something, the first thing you do is throw all the ingredients in the bowl and then you start mixing. And the mixing part is the doing the work. Okay, so in chapter 15, I introduced the term conversion costs. And I told you in chapter 15 that I was only introducing the word then because that's where the book threw it in, but that we'd really talk about it in this chapter, and now it's time. So when we think about the costs of products, we know that all products include three separate types of costs: direct materials, direct labor, and overhead. But what you'll notice here is we only have columns for direct materials and conversion costs. We do not have separate columns for direct labor and overhead. That term conversion costs means the direct labor and overhead combined. So our assumption for everything we do in this class, our assumption will be this: all direct materials are added at the beginning of the process. And then the conversion costs, that is the direct labor and overhead, are incurred. We experience those costs throughout the time that we're working on them. We spread them evenly across the time that we're working on them. So what does this mean in the context of this problem, the way we're given this information? Let's go back here to our work in process at the beginning of the month. It tells us that and as of June 1st, as of the open of business on June 1st, beginning of the month, we were already working on 10,000 units. Those units were started in May. What that means is all the direct materials for those units were added in May. So what, did we add any direct materials to those in June? No, we already had all the direct materials in and we were working on them. The 38% complete means we had done 38% of the work. In other words, 38% of the conversion costs for those units were incurred in May. So how much more work did we have to do on those in June? If we did 38% of the work in May, how much do we have left to do in June? 62%. Everyone agree with that? We already did 38% in May. So that means to finish those units, we have 62% more of the work to do in June. Okay. Next, we complete, oh shoot, I totally misread this. Completed and transferred to next processing department. I thought I didn't read the whole thing, so I need to backtrack on something I said earlier in this exercise. Completed and transferred to next step, that includes these 10,000 units. So I thought this was started, the units we started, and I am guilty of not reading before I started speaking. So completed and transferred out means we completed these 10,000 units plus another 50,000 units that we started this month. And I very much apologize for that. I hate when I do that. So of the 60,000 units that were finished, disregard what I said earlier, of the 60,000 units that we finished, 10,000 were from beginning inventory, 50,000 we started in June and finished in June. And then we had another 11,500 units that we started in June but did not finish. We did 70% of the work in June. The other 30% of the work will be done in July to finish up those units. So regardless of what I said earlier, does that make sense, what I just explained, now that I actually read every word on the screen? Okay. So let's go down to our first task for this exercise, which says all direct materials are placed in process at the beginning of production. Determine the direct materials and conversion equivalent units of production for June. I'm going to define that for you in a minute. We are using what's known as the FIFO system. Whoops. FIFO, first in, first out. That may sound familiar to you from chapter 6 on inventories. Don't worry, we're not redoing chapter 6, but you do need to understand what that term means. First in, first out, or FIFO, means we assume that the first thing that happens is we finish up the beginning inventory, and then we start new inventory for the current month. That may, just like in chapter 6, that may not be what actually happens. So in the example of the refinery, we don't finish up the crude oil from May before we add more crude oil from June. It's a continuous process. We're constantly feeding in new raw crude oil to the beginning of the system. We don't finish up May and then start June. But what we are talking about here is how we present it in our accounting records, which does not have to be exactly how it happens in the real world of the manufacturing facility. So let's start with our beginning inventory. Remember, we had 10,000 units and they were 38% complete. So that's 10,000 whole units of inventory. These are the units that we started in May. And what we are accounting for here is the work that was done in June, or the costs that were added in June. So if we started those units in May, when did we add the direct materials?
In May.
In May. Did we add any direct materials in June? No. So we're just going to put a 0 there. Just going to put a 0 there. We didn't add any direct materials in June. They were already in from May. But we did still have some work to do. And if we go back up to this, remember, we were told at the beginning of the month they were 38% complete. So how much more did we have to do? 62%. So what is 62% of 10,000 whole units? 6,200. So we take the percent of the work that was done this month and multiply by the whole units. We did 62% of the work on 10,000 units. That's equivalent to doing 6,200 whole units worth of work. That's why the term is equivalent units. So again, I took the percent of the work we did in this period and multiplied by the whole units from the first column. Okay. Now we have our units that were, the next line says units that were started and completed. So here we're told that we completed 60,000 units, but we know that 10,000 of those units we actually started in May. So how many of those units did we start and complete in June? 50,000, thank you. So if we started and completed them in June, we did all the work in June. We incurred all of the cost in June. We added all of the direct materials, that's 50,000 units of direct materials. And we did all of the conversion work. We added all the conversion costs, all the direct labor and overhead, 50,000 units worth of conversion cost. So we are told here, I hadn't read this yet out loud. We are told that production begins in the drawing department and finishes in the winding department. So most companies that use a production cost system, most companies, did I just say production cost? I meant process cost if I said production. Most companies that use process costing have multiple steps in their process, and they're going to have multiple work in process accounts. The first step in the process, in this case, is the drawing department. So these are all, if you want to think of it like clean costs, these are costs that were all added directly to the drawing department. But when we finish these units, they aren't done. They're just done in the drawing department, and they get transferred into the winding department. And so what did we transfer to the winding department in June? The 60,000 units we finished. That includes the ones we started in the previous month and just completed this month. And it includes all the ones that we started and completed. How much cost did we add this month? Well, we added only 50,000 units. I'm just adding here. We added only 50,000 units of direct materials cost because the 10,000 that we started in May, those costs were added in May. And again, just adding down that column, we added another 56,200 units worth of conversion costs. The first 3,800 units of conversion costs for the beginning inventory were already in the beginning inventory. They were added in May. And so what we're totaling here on this line, what we are totaling is just the costs that were added in June, the units of work that were completed in June. Make sense so far? Okay. The next line is for our ending inventory then. What's still left in the drawing department? And here we are told that at the end of June, there were still 11,500 units in process. These are units that were started in June, but we didn't finish. But our rule is all the direct materials, we throw all the ingredients in the bowl at the beginning of the month. And so that means for those units, we added 11,500 units of direct material cost. 11,500 units of direct material cost, but not that many units of conversion cost because we weren't done. So up here at the top of my screen, you can see that those units were 70% complete. We did 70% of the work in June. 70% of 11,500 is 8,050 units. 8,050 units worth of work. That's the 11,500 whole units times the percent of the work that was completed this month. That's given us 70%. And now we just need to add these last two rows together. So for whole units, 71,500. 10,000 were in beginning inventory. We started another 61,500 during the month. We finished 60,000 and transferred those to the next step in the process. And we had 11,500 that we were still working on at the end of the month. During the month, we added 61,500 units of direct materials. Those are for the units we started this month. And we incurred 64,250 equivalent units of conversion cost. That is direct labor and overhead. Everybody good up to this point? Any questions about part A?
What did you get the 8,050?
So it's the 11,500 whole units times the 70%. So that's from right here.
Oh, okay.
11,500 times 70% is where the 8,050 came from. Any other questions on part A? Okay. So part B is for the winding department for the same period, June 1st. I'm going to pause the video and ask you to try part B on your own. You can use the check my work button. Once you've finished, you can restart the video, and I will briefly explain my answers that will be on the screen. So pause the video now and try part B on your own. Okay, so as we look at the solution to part B, using the information that was given up here at the top for the winding department, we had 4,000 units that were in process from May. So we didn't add any more direct materials to those, but we did have to still do, they were 35% done, so we still had to do 65% of the work in June. 65% of 4,000 is 2,600. There were 60,500 units that were completed and transferred out. 4,000 of those were from the beginning inventory. So the rest, 56,500, were started and completed in June. We added all the direct materials and did all of the work, adding down to get the numbers for the transferred to finished goods, because the winding department is the next step in the process, the last step in the process, excuse me. Finally, the ending inventory, we were told it was 3,500 units and that they were 60% complete. So we added all the direct materials, but only 60% of the conversion costs, and that's where the totals come from at the bottom. So as I said, we're going to do this step 1 and 2 another time or 4 before we finish the chapter. But this is your first introduction to this concept of calculating equivalent units that are based on the percentage of the work that was done in the period that we're reporting. Any questions before we move on to our next exercise? Okay, so for our next exercise, we're given a table of information, and we're going to be calculating cost per equivalent unit based on this information. This is the first exercise where I think it's really beneficial for us to use the Excel template that I provided. And so that's what I'm going to do. In order to keep this big enough for people in the classroom to see and for it not to be too small on the video, I'm just going to go to the template, because I don't think I have enough room to tile them and still make it readable. You may need to jump back and forth, or if your screen is big enough, you may want to put both the given information from the exercise side by side with this report. I have the text from the problem printed out, and so I'm just going to refer to that and not jump back and forth and confuse people. So I'm going to explain where the information is coming from in that given table of information. In the table, it's labeled account work in process for the baking department. We're given beginning balance information. We're given information about what happened during the period. So we already know that in work in process, we add direct materials, direct labor, and overhead. And then we are told how much was finished and transferred out to the next step in the process. And then we're told how much, we're told mostly how much we had left at the beginning, or excuse me, at the end of the month. The information in these debit and credit columns is dollar amounts. The information that's given here in the description are units. If we go to the cost of production report, then what we are doing right now is step 3. But we really have to do steps 1 and 2 also, because the information isn't given to us in a format that's as useful as we might want it to be. And so in this Excel template that I have provided to you, we're going to do steps 1 and 2, and then we'll get to step 3, where we calculate the cost per equivalent unit, which is what we're asked to do for this exercise. So, everybody good? Everybody know where we are, what we're doing? And you're not required to use the template. If you use them, you're not required to turn them in to me or anything else. But if you are using the template and you're not getting the right answer and you want me to take a look at it, certainly feel free to email it to me and ask me to look at it, tell you where you're getting off track. But I just find it useful to organize the information in this way so we can see it. So in that table called the account work in process baking department in the exercise itself, it tells us that on December 1st, we were working on 24,000 units. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in. That's our beginning inventory in process. And then at the end of the month, it tells us direct material for 134,000 units was added during the month. So if I add those together, it's a total of 158,000 units that we were working on at some point during the month. Make that a little bigger. Okay. So our question is, well, where are those 158,000 units? Well, if we're using the FIFO system, first in, first out, the first thing we do is finish up that beginning inventory of 24,000 units. We still, as we will for every single exercise, we still have the assumption that all the direct materials are added at the beginning of the process. So these units were not started in December, they were started in November. So did we add any more direct materials in December? No. Put a big fat 0 in there. But it does tell us that those units were 3/4 completed, and that means 3/4 of the conversion costs. So what is 3/4 of 24,000? Thank you. 18,000 units worth of conversion costs were added during the month of December. Now, I don't know yet how many units were started and completed, but if I look at the information given in the exercise, the last line says goods finished 128,000 units. So we finished 128,000 units. 24,000 of those were started in November. So they weren't started in December. 128,000 minus 24,000 is 104,000 units that were started and completed in December. If they were started and completed in December, that means we added all the direct materials and we did all of the work. Next line is just to put in your totals of equivalent units of direct materials and conversion costs that were transferred out during the month. How about our ending inventory? Well, the last line in our given information says We don't know how many units were in ending inventory, but we can figure it out. We know there were a total of 158,000 units from right here. We know we were working on a total of 158,000 units during the month. And 128,000 units were finished. So how many were left still unfinished? 158,000 minus 128,000. There were 30,000 units that we were still working on at the end of the month. Of those units, we had added all of the direct materials, but it tells us they were only half done. So we did half of the work. We incurred half of the conversion costs, or $15,000 worth. Oops. So we now know what all of the units were. We know where they were at the beginning and the end of the month. So that's steps 1 and 2. We already know how to do that, but I think it makes it easier for us to sort through the information to put it in this format that we're accustomed to seeing. Okay. Everybody good so far? Okay, now you'll notice in step 3 of this report, which is where I am right now, it's these lines right here from 18 to 29. You'll notice that the columns line up under the columns from step 2 for direct materials and for conversion costs. This part, this line 22, where I am right now, the heading says total costs incurred this period. This is the first time we have seen dollars. So steps 1 and 2 are units only. Now we're bringing in the dollars. So total costs incurred this period for direct materials. Total costs for direct materials. If we look at the given information, the second line says direct materials. We added $234,500 worth of direct materials this month. Everyone see where that's coming from in the exercise? Okay. And then the next column is for conversion costs. And we know that conversion costs are the combination of direct labor, which is the next line down, $150,000, and the factory overhead, which was applied, the next line down, $375,000. So those are dollars that are just given to us in that table of information. We can see them being debited or added to the work in process account. We already know our total equivalent units for direct materials. It's right here, cell C16 in the template. We added direct materials for 134,000 units this month. It's the 134,000 units that we started this month. And so now it's just a matter of dividing the total cost divided by the units to get our cost per unit. And we can do the same thing for our conversion costs. Again, we already have our units right here in cell E16, and then divide. Total costs incurred during the month divided by the total equivalent units of conversion work. To keep going with this template, then the next part is assigning costs to production. The beginning work in process is the very first line in the given information. We're looking for dollars here, $116,700. And then the costs added this period were for direct materials and conversion costs. And so really, that second part of step 3 is the cost summary. $876,200 worth of direct materials and conversion costs went through this account. Okay, so I just went back to figure out I had a math error, and in the beginning inventory, back in step 2 here, it tells us that those units were 75% or 3/4 complete. We only had 1/4 of the work left to do. So that should have been 6,000. So I'm just updating that so it is the correct number. Okay. So I apologize again. I'm not batting 1,000 today. So beginning inventory, 24,000 units. The problem told us they were 3/4 completed, so we had only 1/4 left to do. Okay, so that brings our units down to 125. That's better. Okay. Any questions about what I just updated, what I just corrected? Everybody's good? Okay. So if you hear me, if you catch me doing something like that, please go ahead and bring it to my attention. Okay. So we can now finish up step 4 of this report. The first line in step 4, line 33, says beginning work in process. We were told that that was 116,700. So again, steps 1 and 2 are units. Step 3 has us calculating the cost per unit. And then we have our cost summary. Step 4 assigns those costs to all of the different units, the beginning inventory that we finish up. So that's what we're going to do next. Whoops, the next line says cost to complete beginning inventory. Again, you'll notice that this column C is all for direct materials and column E is all for conversion costs. So for the beginning inventory, did we add?
I just had a question.
Yep.
The previous step, just how did you get this, that number there?
Yep, so that is the total of the direct materials that were added during the month and the direct
Okay.
labor and overhead combined.
Thank you.
So for this beginning inventory, we started it in the previous month. We started in November. We didn't add any direct materials. How do I know that? Because I have a 0 right here in step 2. How many units of direct materials did we add? None. So we added 0 costs for direct materials. Column E is for conversion costs. I'm going to use a formula here. So in step 2, the beginning inventory right here, we added 6,000 units of conversion costs. And those units we calculated here in step 3 cost $4.20 each. So 6,000 units from step 2 times or at $4.20 each. We added $25,200 to those units to finish them up. Add across to the far right column. So we had $116,700 already in those units. That includes the direct material, all the direct materials, and 75% of the conversion costs. We added 25% more worth of conversion costs to finish those units And there's the total cost for our beginning inventory, $141,900. Everybody good so far? The next line says cost for units started and completed. So we already calculated that up here too. Units started and completed, 104,000. We have $104,000 worth of direct materials at $1.75 each. And 104,000 units of conversion costs at $4.20 each. And then we just need to add across. The next line says total cost transferred out. So that's going to include the beginning inventory, 141,900, plus the cost for the units started and completed, $760,700 total. That's the dollars that were transferred out of this department and into whatever comes next. So this exercise says it's for the baking department. Maybe the next step is the packaging department. I don't know. And then our last step, we're going to follow that same process. This is for the ending work in process. We have 30,000 units of direct materials at $1.75 this month, and 15,000 units of conversion costs at $4.20. Add across, then add down to find our total costs for the month. And here's one thing that I find very helpful about using this template. These two numbers have to be the same. The two numbers that I just highlighted in yellow have to be the same. So we know if they're not the same, we did something wrong. So you have a way of checking yourself. Can also point out these two numbers have to be the same. Whoops, sorry. And all of the numbers that we calculated here in step 2, we multiply by the dollars per unit here that we calculated in step 3 to fill in this bottom part of the chart. Now that we've done all of that, and again, I think using the template gives us a nice way of organizing it. You absolutely could have answered the questions in this exercise without filling in the chart. But it's much easier, neater, more linear to use that chart. And plus, this is the way that we would normally present the information, just as I showed you in that exhibit 8. So we're going to be able to pull all the information we need to answer the questions. Question number 1 in exercise 4 says direct materials cost per equivalent unit. That's right here, $1.75. Conversion cost per equivalent unit is right here, $4.20. Cost of beginning work in process completed during December, question number 3. It's right here, total cost for beginning inventory, $141,900. Number 4, cost of units started and completed during December. It's the next line down, $618,800. And then finally, cost of the ending work in process right here. Whoops, sorry, right here, line 38 in the template, $115,500. So I'm just going to plug those in. Any questions about those before I So they all came directly from the template and they're all labeled in the template. Whoops. Okay, everybody's good? Everybody's okay with all those numbers and where they came from? Okay. Last question. Assuming that the direct materials cost is the same for November and December, did the conversion cost per equivalent unit increase, decrease, or remain the same in December? And so we have to do one more math step here. We know the costs of the beginning work in process here in number 3 is 141,900, and that was for 24,000 units. So 141,000, whoops. $141,900 divided by 24,000 units is $5.9125 per unit. Okay. And here in number 4, we know that the units that were started and completed in December, which was 104,000 units, had a cost per unit of $5.95. Everybody okay with those? Okay. So we know that the cost is made up of direct materials and conversion costs, which includes direct labor and overhead combined. We're told that the direct materials stayed the same. And we know the total cost increased. So what must have happened to the conversion cost during the month? It must have increased. Okay. Any questions on that exercise? Okay. Let's clear my drawings. And we'll keep going. Okay. Next exercise. Costs per equivalent unit. So we could take this information and plug it into the template. I'm not sure we need to go through that for this exercise because a lot of it is given to us. So let's see if we can do this without using the template, because I think it's straightforward enough. We'll go back to the template definitely for the next exercise. So Georgia Products Incorporated completed and transferred 89,000 particle board units of production from the pressing department. There was no beginning inventory in process in the department. So certainly that can happen. Is it likely to happen for a going concern? Probably not, but it can happen. The ending in process inventory was 2,400 units, which were 3/5 or 60% complete as to conversion cost. All materials were added at the beginning of the process. Again, that's an assumption we are going to make every single time for this class. Is that a realistic assumption in the real world? No. Because most people, as we heard in this class, add the ingredients one at a time as you're making the cookies. That's certainly true in many manufacturing circumstances as well. We make that assumption in this class because it simplifies our approach. But it's not, if you understand how it works in the simplified approach, we certainly could expand on that in a real world setting. So we know our direct materials cost for the month and our direct labor costs and our factory overhead. We also know we're going to be combining the direct labor and factory overhead into one conversion cost. So our total conversion cost, we can go ahead and do that now. The total conversion cost is direct materials plus direct labor. Nope, sorry, said that wrong. Total conversion cost is direct labor, 28,100 plus factory overhead, 40,698. Direct labor plus overhead. To calculate conversion cost per equivalent unit, though, we need to know what our conversion cost, or excuse me, our conversion units, our equivalent units of conversion costs were. So if you, as I said, if you find it more useful to use the template, you are welcome to do so. I'm just going to do it here on the screen. So we have our conversion equivalent units. There was no beginning inventory. We finished, completed, and transferred out 89,000 particle board units. So since there was no beginning inventory, all of those units must have been started this month. So 89,000 equivalent whole units for the units that were completed. And then we have our ending inventory, which is, we're told 2,400 units, and they are 3/5 complete, or 60%. And so our conversion equivalent units would be 60% of the 2,400 that were still in ending inventory, plus the 89,000 that were started and completed. Everyone agree with that? Okay, so now we can find our cost per equivalent unit by taking the total cost that we already found in part A and divide by the total units that we just calculated. So 45 cents per equivalent unit. For conversion costs. And for our direct materials equivalent units, remember our assumption that we, put this down here, our assumption is that we add all the direct materials when we begin the units. There was no beginning inventory. If we had beginning inventory, of course, the direct materials for those would have been added in the previous period. So we're simply adding together the units that were started and completed, along with the ending inventory, because all of the direct materials were added at the beginning of the process. So even though that ending inventory isn't done as it applies to conversion costs, all the direct materials would be in. And our direct materials cost was given as $219,360. Divide that by the number of, whoops, should be a comma, number of units. And I got $2.40. And so we were able to do that just on the screen because it was a little simpler exercise with no beginning inventory. But certainly, if you find it beneficial, I would encourage you to use that blank template for any of these exercises, including for the homework problem and for the exam. I'm 99% sure if you watch the video of the mastery problem for chapter 17, you will see me using the template in that video as well. So you know where to find the template. It's in the reference materials folder in Brightspace for chapter 17. Go ahead and put my green check marks in there. Any questions about that exercise before we move on? This class is over at 3:15, right? Okay. So we have time to keep going. So this exercise, exercise 6, I believe, is the one in the chapter 17 folder in the reference materials that you have the completed cost report. I'm not encouraging you right now to download that because we're going to do it together. But I would tell you that it's here for reference for later on. Let's actually, in the interest of time, because I am hoping to stay on track here, I'm going to skip exercise 6 for right now. And if we do not get, well, let's just see how far we can get, because you do have that resource there in Brightspace. This is an Excel file and it does have formulas in it. So if you're looking at a number and you're wondering where does that come from, you can click on the cell to see where the number comes from or what the formula is. But let's go on to exercise 7 in the interest of time. And I'm going to come back over, actually, I'm going to just getting a clean copy of the template so we can use that without me having to erase. Okay. So if you want to use the template, you may want to open a clean copy of it. The template is not locked, so even though I have grayed out the spots that you aren't intended to change, you can't just erase without doing it, basically cell or section by section. So let's go on to exercise 7. The debits to work in process roasting department for Morning Brew Coffee Company for August, together with information concerning production, are as follows. So we're basically given the same information in this table as we were given in exercise 4 that we did together a few minutes ago. It just looks a little bit different, but we're told how much we had in process at the beginning of the month, how much complete it was, what the total dollars were. We know that that is going to include both the direct materials, which are broken out, and conversion costs here. So they give us the detail of how much of that is for direct materials, how much for conversion costs. We know how many units were added during August and how many dollars. So that's the direct materials. We know what the conversion costs were for August. These are dollars. We know how many units were left at the end of the month, how much completed they were. And then this is how much was transferred out, 14,600 pounds, but we don't know the dollars here or here. So actually I'm going to give you the option of whether you choose to use the template. It's nice to have the template because you can use formulas in Excel rather than doing all of the math. But because we have this here, which is essentially the template, I'll go ahead and just put my numbers in here to avoid the jumping back and forth. You can choose to do whatever you think is easier or more organized for you. So we start with the units. So this is what I was referring to as step one. In process, at the beginning of the month, we already have 700 pounds. And then it tells us that coffee beans added during August was 14,300 pounds. So for step one, we have identified 15,000 pounds of coffee beans that went through the roasting department during the month of August. Remember, steps 1 and 2 are units only. It has it labeled here for us, unit information. Keep in mind, there are no dollars in this first part. It's all units. So we start with our 700 units that were in beginning inventory. Again, we have the assumption, no direct materials added later on in the process. All direct materials are added at the beginning. So those were already in process as of August 1st, so we didn't add any more direct materials. But they were 20% complete, which means we had how much left to do?
80%,
80%.
560.
Thank you. So 560, 80% of 700. In step 1, it says received from material storeroom 14,300 units. Whoops, hang on. 14,300 units were started in August, but they were not all completed. The last line of the given information tells us goods finished. No, sorry. It tells us goods finished during August was 14,600 pounds. Everyone see that? Last line of the given information right here. Whoops, right here. Goods finished during August, 14,600 pounds. There were 400 pounds still in ending inventory. Of the 14,600 pounds that were finished during August, the first 700 were from beginning inventory. So how many did we start and complete in August? A couple different ways you can get at that number. You can take the 14,600 pounds that were finished and subtract the 700 that came from beginning inventory. That's probably the easiest. So we know that this number transferred to finished goods had to be 14,600 because that was given. If 700 of those were in beginning inventory, then it must be that 13,900 were started and completed in August. If those were started and completed in August, then we did all the work in August. We added all the direct materials and all of the conversion costs. The units transferred to finished goods then in August, 14,600. The costs that were added during the month, $13,900 worth of direct materials, $14,460 worth of conversion costs. How much inventory did we have left in ending inventory at the end of August? 400 pounds. Our assumption that we will use for every exercise and problem and homework problem and exam is that all the direct materials are added at the beginning of the process, but then the conversion costs are incurred uniformly throughout the process. And it tells us right here that they were 42% complete. That means that we had incurred 42%, 400 units times 42%, 168 units. And then simply add. Oops. On to step 3. Any questions so far? So as I already pointed out in the template that I created, we have two columns of cost, direct materials and conversion cost, just like we had two columns for the units, the equivalent units. So the total costs for August in the roasting department. These are costs that were added in August, and we can see somewhere here. Let me show you in the table. So here's the coffee beans added during August. Here's the dollar amount. Whoops, here's the dollar amount, $65,780. As long as I'm here, I'll point out the conversion cost, $21,942. So in step 3, we're pulling in the costs that were added during the month for conversion and for direct materials. And then the total equivalent units come from step 2, just above, whoops. 14,300 for direct materials, 14,628 for conversion costs. And then we need to divide total dollars divided by units. The last part of step 3 is the cost summary. So this was given at the beginning of the exercise, inventory in process. So these are all dollars in this step. Inventory in process, $34.79. Costs incurred during during August includes both the direct materials and the conversion costs, which, remember, as we already saw in exercise 5, could be given to you as direct labor and overhead separately. They would need to be combined. So I've just added together the direct materials and conversion costs that were added this month. And then I need to add that to the cost of the beginning inventory to get the total. And finally, we need to assign where those costs were, or determine where those costs were, what happened to them during the month. We started the month with $34.79 for our direct materials and conversion costs in the beginning inventory. To complete those units, we didn't add any direct materials because of our assumption that the direct materials were added when we started those units in July. But we did have to add conversion costs. So we go up here to step 2 to see how much we added for conversion costs. Beginning inventory, here are the conversion costs, units, 560. And in step 3, we had calculated that each one of those 560 units of conversion costs had a cost of $1.50 per unit. So I'm simply multiplying together the units from step 2 times the cost per unit from step 3. And then add across. So that beginning inventory already had $34.79 at the beginning of the month, and we just added to it $840 worth of conversion costs to finish up those units. We finish those units and we transfer them on to whatever comes next, whether it's the finished goods department or the next step in the production process. Everybody good so far? Okay. Started and completed. Again, we go up to step 2 here. Started and completed 13,900 units. We incurred all the direct materials and all of the conversion costs. We have the cost per unit right here at the end of step 2. So we take the units multiply by the cost per unit for direct materials. The units times the cost per unit for conversion costs, and then add across to get the total. Add that total to the cost for the beginning inventory, and we have the total cost that were transferred to whatever comes next, in this case, finished goods. And then we can do the last step, inventory in process at the end of the month. It was 400 units. We had all the direct materials and 168 units of conversion costs. Multiply the units from step 2 times the cost per unit from step 3. Add across. Then add down. And that number, why does it not match? I just add wrong. 400. Yep, I added wrong. There. There we go. There we go. And so that number, total cost assigned to the roasting department, needs to match this number right here from the top in the cost summary. If they don't match, something's wrong. If it's a tiny bit of an error, it could be a rounding error. So be careful about that. But I just knew I had made a math error because they didn't match. Because I didn't add correctly, didn't add at all. Last step, and then we'll be done with this exercise and done for today, but hold on a minute, is to see how our information changed from the previous month. So we're given the information at the beginning of the exercise. Direct materials for July was $4.70. So that's given. You don't see this right up here. Direct materials were $4.70 in July, and conversion costs were $1.35 in July. So direct materials went from $4.70 to $4.60. That's a decrease of 10 cents per unit. And conversion costs went from $1.35 up to $1.50. So that's an increase of 15 cents. So that's the end of this exercise. Obviously, we did not finish the chapter today. So we will carry over to Thursday, but I do want you to try exercise 6 on your own. Use that template, the completed template I have in Brightspace in the chapter 17 reference materials if needed. And then at the beginning of class on Thursday, I'll answer any questions that you have from exercise 6, and then we'll finish up 8, 9, and 10. And then we will move on to chapter 18 on Thursday as well. So obviously the chapter 17 exercises do not need to be submitted today since we're not done, but do still plan on having the chapter 18 pre-quiz done for Thursday. So any questions about anything before I stop the recording?